Good afternoon. My name is George from Chattanooga, Tennessee. My question is, does the Greek Hebrew words for blood and death means the same in reference to Jesus' sacrifice? What cleanses and offers forgiveness for someone's sins? It is the shedding of his blood or his death alone? Thank you.
Stephen, George really had two questions for you, beginning with this one. In the languages of the Bible, Greek and Hebrew, are blood and death the same word?
No, they are not. Blood and death are separate words. In the Hebrew language, dam and mut for blood and death, and in the Greek language, haima and nekros are also two different words, and they do not necessarily mean the same thing.
So when we think of the atonement of Jesus, was it necessary that his atonement involve blood, or could he have been strangled or died some other way?
Yeah, that's a great question, too. And George, thank you for asking that. There's a lot of heat and fire, on this question. I've heard people called heretics because they, supposedly minimized the blood and the bloodshed of Jesus. So let's try to be careful here and understand that when we talk about atonement, it's going to take both. It's going to take bloodshed and it's going to take death. And we really don't want to separate the two or make a case where one seems to be, emphasized over and against the other. Remember, friends, that Christ's death and his atoning work on the cross is the fulfillment of all of the prophetic structures of the atoning work in the Old Testament, where God provided for the covering, the temporary covering for sin. Jesus' death and cross work and bloodshed would be the final and full sacrifice. Go all the way back to Leviticus and chapters 1 through 16. It spells out how the animals were to be slaughtered, their blood to be collected, their blood to be splattered on the altars once a year on the mercy seat, as that atoning tradition and ritual which took the life of an innocent animal, and the blood was seen, as it were, by God. The life of the flesh is in the blood, Leviticus 17:11. Blood represents life. That's why Moses instructed the people on behalf of God when he said, I've given you this to put on the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. Again, the scriptures don't separate the two. It's blood and life. Blood represents life, and the taking of life needed to be represented in the shedding of that blood. So is it Christ's blood that atones for our sin, or is it his death? And I think that's what George is after. He didn't just have to be killed and his blood shed. He had to be crucified. Why? Because this was the fulfillment of Scripture. Go back to Psalm chapter 22, and it is a description of the crucifixion. You go back to the curse of one hanging on a tree. This is the curse Christ bore in becoming sin for us. And God established in the Old Testament the foreshadowing of the death of God the Son through this sacrificial system, which required the shedding of blood. In fact, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22 says, according to the law, all things are cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Now, don't think for a moment that all Jesus had to do was cut himself, and that did it. No, he had to die, and in also dying, shedding his blood. So, could Jesus have died for sin without shedding of blood? No. That would have contradicted all that God revealed in his word in the atoning work of this final sacrifice.